Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third online lecture where we're going to talk about Marx and his ideas. So, to start with, just to get a sense of who the people are we're going to be talking about, this is Marx. If you haven't seen him before, and he's very famous for his big, bushy beard and also kind of his big, flowing hair. Another person who's going to be coming up is Friedrich Engels, who was Marx's collaborator. So they wrote a lot of works together, such as the Communist Manifesto. But then, as you might have picked up in the movie Marx and Soho, Engels also financially supported Marx. Um, and for reasons we'll talk about here more in a minute, but Engels' family actually owned some factories. So Engels comes from a capitalist background, um, but nevertheless really saw the world in the same terms as Marx and tried to transform his factories to be more in line with Marx and Engels' ideals. But nevertheless, because of his financial background, Engels is able to help support Marx and to fund his intellectual endeavors. And then here is Bakunin, who was also mentioned in the movie, and this is the guy, the anarchist that Marx, was drinking with, and then got into a fight with, and then Bakunin, pees out Marx's window, and then they both pass out on the floor for the night. All right, so a little bit about Marx's biography. One thing to note is that he was born in Prussia, which is now part of Germany, not Russia. So even though Marx's ideas, or at least in name, were implemented in Russia and the Soviet Union. And lots of people would tend to think that he was Russian. He's not. He's actually German, or technically Prussian. As you read about, and I think you probably saw in the Marx and Soho movie, Marx was very politically active. And so, in this sense, he wasn't strictly a sociologist, in that he wasn't just studying the world to study it and to figure out how it works. He was trying to study it in order that he could implement some changes. So, more than just trying to diagnose what's going on in the world, he also wanted to come up with prescriptions or solutions to the problems that he is identifying when he looks out into the world. And this aspect, the idea that Marx is very politically active, and that again he is studying society for in order to change it, is in this case literally enshrined on Marx's tombstone. So here is Marx, who we saw before. At the top of his tombstone, it says "Workers of all lands unite," which was part of that's the closing line of the Communist Manifesto, kind of this charge that we shall be all workers should form together, and by forming together, they can create a more just and utopian society. But then at the bottom down here, we see this quote that Marx wrote in one of his essays. Philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. So traditionally, sociology's role is to just diagnose the situation in the world, just to interpret it or understand it in various ways, not to go out and change it. Uh, but nevertheless, Marx didn't think of himself strictly as a sociologist. He was very much informed by social ideas of the day and economic ideas of the day, but he had this broader political agenda. All right, so not only is Marx politically active, he's politically radical or revolutionary. And as the A&E writing point out, radical means, like if you have radical political thought, it means you want to kind of like strip things down all the way to the root in order to reform them. So you don't just want to tinker with things, you want to fundamentally transform what's going on in a society. And that's what Marx wanted. He wanted to create an entire new social order, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But because Marx was so politically radical, that led to him to being kicked out of a number of countries, which you saw. He gets kicked out of Prussia, he goes to Brussels, he gets kicked out of there, he goes to Paris, he gets kicked out. He's just getting kicked out all over the place. And so this led to him having difficulties finding a job that he could support himself with. And ultimately, that ended up him being quite poor, and which you got glimpses of in the Marx and Soho movie. And as the movie notes, a number of Marx's children died when they were quite young. And we don't have definitive evidence of this, but it's quite likely that at least a number of those children died just because of how poor Marx was. And one measure of this poverty, as it relates to Marx's children, is that when one of his sons died, Marx didn't have enough money in order to pay for a funeral for his son, and so one of his neighbors had to lend it to him. So Marx faced financial difficulties throughout his adult life, in part tracing back to his political activity. Well, as the movie you watched noted, Marx eventually settled in London, in the Soho part of London. And the entire the joke of the movie title, the title of the movie you watch, Marx in Soho, is that Marx was supposed to come back from heaven or wherever into Soho where he had lived, so the Soho part of London, but instead gets to the Soho part of New York. And from there, Marx is able to offer some insights into what he sees going on in the world today. So during Marx's time in Soho, he very famously would work 60 hours a week in the reading room of the British Museum. And this is where he wrote the book Das Kapital. We just refer to it as Capital in the English context. And this is the book that many kind of see as being, his masterpiece. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but Marx basically offers two critiques of capitalism. One is a more humanitarian critique, and this comes about in his early thinking. And then one is an economic critique, and that comes out in his later works, principally in Capital. And just to get a sense of where Marx was spending his time, this is the reading room at the British Museum. And other famous authors and thinkers have worked here, probably the most famous of which is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes, did his work here, or some of his work here, like Marx did. All right, we're now going to switch over to talking about the historical context in which Marx was living and writing.